What's up everybody, long time no edit, and I am finally back with another edited response video, this time in response to the Gravel Institute by special request by $30 patron Mikhail the Stray Cat. If any of you would like to see an edited response video done to a video of your choice, well then by all means go check out my Patreon page down below in the description box. $20 patrons will get an edited response video to any video of their choice. Within reason though. I promise that here on out, edited response videos will not take as horrendously long as this one did. Now without further ado, let's get into this.
There's one thing Americans can agree on. We value democracy.
No, I value libertarianism above all else, and as far as types of governance goes, I actually prefer republicanism over democracy, but who's splitting hairs here?
Why does everyone agree that the government doesn't really work for us? Conservatives have an easy answer. Big government is the problem.
Keep this statement in mind. She says later that it's just not true, so we're going to respond to each of her points one by one.
They say the government infringes on people's freedoms and is constantly getting bigger.
Why yes, with the raising minimum wage laws, gun control laws implemented in past years, the Patriot Act along with NSA, multiple different business control laws that were implemented in the mid-20th century, including the Jim Crow laws by the way, and the mandated employee provisions implemented under Obamacare on top of them that already existed before Obamacare. And probably most importantly and above all else, look at the amount of regulations that we have accumulated over the years, especially ever since Reagan.
They say that if we just defund expensive government programs, we could lower taxes for the average American.
Sounds like common sense to me. I mean, if we slashed spending, why keep taxes as high as they were before?
With that money back in the hands of ordinary people, they say, people could handle their problems on their own.
Not as simple cut and dry as it would first sound, and the end results are probably not as pretty as we'd like, but keep in mind the word could. In theory, the average American could invest more of their own hard-earned money in personal expenses and investments instead of it being taxed out of their wallet by the government.
But there's a big problem with that. It's just not true.
Except it totally is.
Sure, the US government is big, but not as big as it used to be. As a percentage of the economy, federal spending is smaller now than it was in 1954.
Between these 2 points that you're highlighting, there is barely any difference at all, actually. And by what your graph is showing right here, I'm surprised that you did not have the starting point a little bit earlier, just saying. Also, not that government spending is everything, because a government can, at least in theory, be efficient and frugal with its spending whilst at the same time being all big and intrusive as well. But another thing that you also have to keep in mind here is that you're talking about government spending as a percentage of the total US economy. You have to keep in mind that our economy was a lot smaller way back in the 50s, as measured by total GDP. So whilst government spending as a percentage of the total US economy might be sporadic, the same, or even smaller now as compared to back then, as a raw number of spending, our spending has overall gone up.
And the US spends less on government than other countries, like Germany or Finland.
This figure of government expenditure you show us is on a percentage basis, so of course said percentage is going to be a lot lower for us than other countries that don't even have a GDP to compete with the US. According to worldometers.com, as of 2017, Finland is $252 billion in its GDP. Germany, despite being 4th place in world countries' GDP, is still not even at $4 trillion, as they're just at $3.693 trillion in GDP. And the good old US of A is at a whopping $19.485 trillion GDP. If we apply these government expenditure percentages you've provided, Brianna, to these raw number GDP numbers for all these 3 countries you've pulled out and do the math, the raw number of government spending in Finland would be about $134 billion. Germany would be $1.645 trillion, and the United States would be a whopping $6.847 trillion in raw government spending. That ain't no small government right there. But when you have so freaking many billionaires living in the land of the free, of course that government spending as a percentage is going to get dwarfed. So unless we were to put a steel wall right in front of the US economy to stop its GDP growth, and or just straight up steal away billions upon billions of people's wealth with no sign of return, this is really no comparison. But really, if I was to be quite sincere, I think a more honest way to judge the size of a government would not necessarily be the raw spending itself. I think it would be the amount of regulations and laws that you have meant to be intervening in other people's lives and the economy, which we'll get more into that a bit later.
That have lower rates of poverty.
Alright, so the source for their claim here comes from the OECD, and looking at the OECD chart for countries with most poverty, they funnily enough have Mexico, of all places, above us, and Israel in the ranking of least poverty-ridden people, which would be absolutely laughable knowing how low their median household income is compared to us, among other societal problems with Mexico that isn't really necessary to go further into in this video. So, it's funny that Gravel omits this piece of information here that would serve as a massive niche in their narrative. So looking in further from that red flag that is raised in our heads, we can see that the OECD measures each country's poverty based off of the median household income of each appropriate country. So it's a massively subjective measurement that is being used here for Gravel to push their specific other countries are better than us in the US talking point. So in theory, somebody who falls a few points below the American poverty line could still be ultimately richer in raw numbers of money than somebody else who's a few points above the German or Finland poverty line.
And higher rates of economic mobility. The American dream is more alive in these big government countries than in America.
Don't try gaslighting my patriotism, you smug sophist.
The American dream is you being able to prosper and flourish under the freedom of this country and off of your own labor and efforts, not you being able to prosper off of somebody else's tax dollar via welfare.
And there's no truth to the claim that the bigger the government, the less free the people.
Does the issue of the NSA and its spying mean nothing to you?
In fact, the countries at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank.
Wait, what the fuck?
A libertarian think tank.
Why does she sound like a ditzy Valley girl saying that?
A libertarian think tank.
Libertarian think tank.
Libertarian think tank.
Okay, I'm done making fun of her pronunciation. Moving on.
Ranks as freer than the United States, countries like Sweden or Denmark have much larger governments relative to their populations than the United States.
Those countries are not freer because or in spite of having bigger governments, you dits.
They're freer because of the fact that they do have smaller and, more importantly, less intrusive governments than us. The only reason why you could say that their governments are so big is because of the more sophisticated and encompassing welfare states that they all have that the American left fawns over compared to us. But the reason why Denmark and Sweden specifically are competitively as free or even freer than the US is because their governments intrude in on their economies less in the area of starting a business, getting electricity flowing, obtaining property, and trading across borders. Denmark does have a government-mandated minimum wage, but Sweden does not, along with their Norwegian cousins, opting instead to have wages negotiated via private unions. And also, since we're on this topic, the Scandinavian countries that the American left fawns over so much all have lower corporate income taxes, higher personal income taxes on segments of the middle class, and higher sales taxes, or VAT taxes as they actually call them. So unless American leftists want to do a major flip-flop and suddenly stop advocating for higher corporate income tax rates, lower taxes on the middle class, and lower sales taxes, I don't think these are the models they really want either. And don't even get me started on how Sweden has been one of the least restrictive countries in the world in response to the coronavirus, which is another thing that the pro-lockdown left are going to have to contend with. That ain't very big government. It's small government. In fact, it might be an anti-government solution against the coronavirus. Point being, this issue is a whole lot more complicated than you make it out to be, Brianna. And honestly, I don't even know of how I feel about judging our country's governments off of other countries' governments, but I would prefer if we judged a government's policies, actions, and agencies off of their own merit, if there are any at all, as opposed to other countries' merits.
A large government doesn't mean an unfree population.
It too much of the time does, though, and thus does not serve being worth the risk.
You see, government isn't a problem in and of itself. In a country as sprawling and diverse as America, there needs to be an institution to build infrastructure and inspect food and to put out fires, to do things that help our communities even if they don't turn a profit.
You know, it's funny that you be talking about how government is not in of itself a problem and then go talking about food inspection, whereas the FDA has been shown to have its own litany of problems with shady approval and inspection processes.
Think of the U.S. Postal Service, which provides hundreds of thousands of good jobs while allowing people to cheaply mail packages across the country.
Don't get so cocky in the idea that we need our postal service to remain in the public sector, because some European countries have put their postal services mostly, if not entirely, in the private sector, and it has worked successfully, at least in Germany, according to Newsweek.
Or think of Medicare and Medicaid, which are credited with having saved millions of lives.
They're also notoriously known for becoming more expensive than what predictions originally said, to the point where they cut back on doctors' salaries and are forced to make budget cutbacks, so it might be generally advised to wean off of Medicare and Medicaid.
So, the problem isn't the size of government, it's who controls the government.
Listen to yourself, Brianna. You say you value democracy. One of the notable things with particularly straight democracy is that sooner, more than later, your opposition will get elected and take control of whatever government apparatuses were set up by the politicians you more preferred or favored before, and then use them on you. I'll grant that welfare agencies and programs are one of the less concerning things, as their intended purpose is to provide for the people as opposed to controlling the people, like the EPA, OSHA, FDA, and even the police do, and welfare agencies are the things you're more advocating for than controlling agencies. But that's the thing. Bigger government normally entails more agencies and organizations of control as you legislate to grow the government to supposedly provide for the people. Like you said earlier, a country as big as the US, quote unquote, requires a lot of government in order to run said country. As the US has gotten bigger, so has the government. ATF, DHS, FBI, ICE, NSA. What do you and your organization have to say about these, Brianna, amongst many other more bureaucracies and organizations that I could mention? Are you for or against the existence of these agencies and the functions they serve? Are you unironically for the NSA spying via the Patriot Act? Why aren't you guys mentioning these things even? Is it because that merely just mentioning their existence in this video would offer more credence to the possibility that maybe big government generally is a problem in of itself? And I want to mention this, that even though I know that this started happening well after this video of theirs was released, but still worth noting of how the Biden administration is making an attempt on whoever they deem to be quote-unquote anti-government extremists. And to rewind a bit, in spite of the fact of how Brianna and her fellow leftists advocate for more welfare agencies and programs, and how I granted the benefit of the doubt that they're not as big a problem as agencies of control, they still stifle the economy and society when they compete in an unfair way or incentivize the people to act in a way that inadvertently goes against the good of the overall economy. Like how we're seeing it before our very eyes, that here in the US, with increased welfare and the stimulus checks in the recent year, have caused people to just plain not work or be slow to getting back to work.
The reason it feels like our politicians don't work for us is because, well, they don't.
Referring back to my last long tangent, isn't that an argument for as to why that big government is inevitably a problem?
Republicans and Democrats alike are working for the people who line their wallets instead.
I know I'm kind of ripping off my 2 cents by asking this, but who in that case are the right people to be running our big government, Brianna?
In 2014, a Princeton University study found that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy.
This is not an argument for the idea that big government is not bad. If anything, it shows how big government is bad. While we're at it, making the government hammer harder for the rich to have exclusive control over, why don't we also make the government hammer smaller at the same time?
Thomas Jefferson wrote of his desire to crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations.
You practically disgrace Thomas Jefferson by quoting him. If anything, Thomas Jefferson would be more in agreement with me than with you, Brianna, where that you guys at the Gravel Institute seem to be focused only on trying to get the control of the government out of rich people's hands. Thomas Jefferson would be focused on that and also at the same time trying to make and keep government small, like he did during his presidency over 200 years ago.
With a government under the control of corporations and the rich, the system has been rigged completely in their favor. In the 1950s, when the economy was growing faster than ever, the richest people in the country paid an income tax of 91%.
While yes, income taxes were at their highest for the top marginal rate back during the 50s and 60s, we also did not have as many of the other types of taxes that we do nowadays. And
That
also throughout
doesn't dismiss the fact that the taxes are higher back then, you idiot!
Canada, get the fuck out of my video, Tim Horn, you insufferable fuckhead.
The corporate income tax was above 50%. But after decades of tax cuts for the rich, the 400 richest Americans pay a lower tax rate than the bottom 10%.
I just want to point out that a lot of the Nordic models have corporate tax rates considerably lower than 50%. Also, a problem with the study you said, Brianna, is that it doesn't take into account the child deductions for poor folks that, if included, would decrease this percentage amount you show here. If what you're trying to get at is effective tax rates after tax credits, deductions, loopholes, etc. for each appropriate group. Just a slight chink in the study sensationalized by the New York Times is all. On the more important and broader point, though, about how taxes on top earners were higher back in the mid-20th century than nowadays, and we thrived supposedly because of or in spite of it, and putting aside the fact that rich folk do exploit tax deductions, credits, and loopholes more than the average Joe is able to, because I'm not against the idea of reforming this area of our tax culture, this point is way oversimplified. Not just because there weren't as many types of taxes, so therefore everybody could digest the income taxes easier, Tim Horn, but also the effective tax rates of top earners back then versus now are closer than what the American left would lead off with. Only a difference of about 10%. They weren't taking that much more amount of total money from rich people's wallets back then than they are now. This response applies to both parties, by the way.
While American workers have become dramatically more productive, their wages have stagnated or fallen. The average hourly wage was higher in 1974 than it was in 2018.
Actually, according to our own source, there was no change, if any at all. There was more of a change between 1972 and 2018 than between 1974 and 2018 as far as workers' wages go, but still. Also, the productivity of the average American worker isn't purely, if at all, because they have all on average worked harder over the last few decades. It's more because of what people like AJW and SMD have termed capital investment. Business owners investing in the heavier usage of computers as they've improved over the decades, better scanning technology, and GPSs for delivery drivers instead of using them regular old maps, and so on and so forth to make it easier to get more work done within the business in general than before. Stephen Michael Davis and Actual Justice Warrior of course go over this concept better than I could ever.
This has led to a stark gap in qualities of life. From 1989 to 2018, the wealthiest 1% of Americans increased their total net worth by $21 trillion. The bottom 50%, meanwhile, saw their net worth decrease by $900 billion. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer.
I honestly do not have much to say at this point, except that I would ask Gravel Institute, how does this correlate to the idea that it's because of small government as to why that this has happened? Because since 1989, you gotta keep in mind of how many corporate bailouts and big-time subsidies that we have given out to corporations and so forth, which that isn't exactly a small government action right there. Not to mention how much has inflation played in, because keep in mind that the massive printing and money is more correlating with a bigger, more intrusive government as opposed to a smaller, less intrusive government. Point being, right now, this stat that Gravel pulls out does not really mean anything to me without any additional context.
For too long, we have been presented with a false choice. Big government versus small government.
No, it's still a couple choices we can choose from, preferably small government as opposed to bigger government.
We're right to be skeptical of the people who lead us. They don't work for you or for me. But it's not because government is big. It's because it's bought.
For one, I'll ask again, who is it that we should entrust the power of government to? I also want to point out that there is barely anybody out there who disagrees with the idea that politicians are corrupt because they are bought out by rich people. Even the conservatives, who you paraphrase Brianna to be saying big government is a problem, don't disagree with that notion either. They just believe it's both, as I do too. Although it might be questionable as to how consistent they are in saying or believing those two things, especially the anti-big government talking point, because it was conservatives for the longest time who advocated for the drug war and banning gay marriage, now are starting to want to ban kicking people off of internet platforms, porn, and desecrating the American flag. But all the same, I think I've sufficiently shown now it is both though. Big government and bought out politicians are both a problem. Even Brianna in her video has inadvertently shown in 1 or 2 points that it is both. Just remember everybody, especially you Gravel Institute, the bigger government you advocate for, the more damage that can and will be done when that power inevitably ends up in the wrong hands. And the fact that politicians can be bought out by rich people does not make that statement any less true. In fact, it strengthens it. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. John Dalberg Acton. The Dark Conservatarian has been brought to you by patrons like you. I'd like to give a special thanks to Cat Chat, The Conundrum, and Mikhail the Stray Cat for all being such loyal followers and donating to me and for my work. And if you'd like to donate to this channel and all my other content creation, link to my Patreon page is down below with some patron rewards. If you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new to this channel, don't forget to hit subscribe and set that bell notification button to all. Hope to see you all later, and God bless.